So what's the best course of action here? Full-on law and order, negotiations, a combination? You have your opinions too, and we're going to put your questions to our panel tonight. John Bocage is a former Grand Council Chief of the Anishinaabe First Nation. He also served the chief of the Wasauksing First Nation. In addition to that, John has also acted as a mediator in land disputes, and John joins me from Parry Sound tonight. John, thank you. And in Toronto, Michael Bryant. Michael was the Ontario Minister of Aboriginal Affairs. He was also a former Ontario Attorney General. And Michael also served as the chief negotiator for the Chippewas of Kettle and Stony Point, resulting in the Ipperwash Settlement Agreement. Ipperwash, Ontario was the scene of a violent confrontation between police and First Nations member Dudley George. That, too, was a land dispute that came to a head in 1995. George was killed by a police officer near the camp. The government and the Chippewas of Kettle and Stony Creek agreed to formal negotiations within a week. That land agreement was finalized in 2016. Michael is now the executive director of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. Welcome to you.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Michael, let me ask you, do you think this has the potential to repeat what we saw in Ipperwash?
Well, so far, it seems that some of the lessons of Ipperwash have been learned.
For example?
Well, the fact that the protests are taking place without people getting arrested and anybody getting shot. I mean, I understand this is like pretty limited progress, but it's a start. I think that as long as the protests are permitted to continue, and particularly as long as the peaceful protests remain peaceful, for now, that's the only thing that can be done with respect to the protests. With respect to resolving the disagreements, the government's clearly going to have to make a decision about whether or not these protests are just about the pipeline, or are they about more than that? Are they about the failure of this government to achieve enough progress on reconciliation? And on that front, I'd want to know what John Bocage has to say.
Yeah, I sure do too. John, what about you? Let me ask you the same question that I asked Michael. And do you think that this has the potential to become another Ipperwash situation?
Well, I'm certainly hoping that it doesn't get into that realm. But any kind of protests where there's tensions rising could actually spill over into creating violence, and certainly that is the last possible thing that we want to see. And I think Michael is right that there's something that's beyond just the pipeline, and I would say that it really gets into the whole aspect of slow movement on reconciliation. It gets into the aspect of nobody has really said, and that I've heard, that yes, the Wet'suwet'en people have title to that land, and I think that's where we need to look at what needs to be done with all of the people, not just the hereditary chiefs, but all of the people within the Wet'suwet'en nation, and understand what their situation is and understand what their issues are.
All right, take a listen to our first question tonight. It comes from Jared.
It's so hard to find solutions to these kind of things because, like, they have a really good point, the protesters, but is the government going to budge? I just don't know. And then, like, if the government does budge, where do they go from there?
I've heard this a lot. People on the street are torn about what should happen. John?
Well, I think that the Prime Minister made some excellent points, and as well as the National Chief, Perry Bellegarde. Open it up, discussion, dialogue. But then I think that there also has to be some very clear notice by government that the land is native, has native title to it. And then once that is acknowledged, you've already achieved one hurdle. Then we start working at some of the other issues.
What do you think, Michael?
Well, I mean, the right to protest is a constitutional right, and it is protected. The right to free association, to gather for these protests, are protected. And people who are protesting, no matter what they're protesting, have the right to do that. Whether or not it achieves the end goal, it obviously is to be seen. There's lots of different ways of getting at that, but what this has certainly done, obviously, is focus the national attention on this issue in a way that just hadn't been there before. And I mean in the sense that it is now dominating the government attention and the nation's attention. And that's a rare opportunity for advancing Indigenous rights. And when these come along, you know, we need to listen to our leaders. I agree with John. You know, Perry Bellegarde, the AFN national chief, his words were very inspiring, frankly. Trudeau, while he's calling for calm, he's also extremely patronizing as ever to those who disagree with him. He has to understand that there are some people who don't agree with him, and he needs to explain why, in fact, violence and disproportionate use of police power is only going to make matters worse and has always made matters worse in the history of Canada.
But the Prime Minister is actually saying he wants the situation to be resolved peacefully. Andrew Scheer, on the other hand, is saying take the law and order approach right now, which leads us to our next comment from Dave. Take a listen.
It's ridiculous. You know, it's all been approved, signed off on. People are, you know, stopping the country's trade. People out of jobs, costing millions and millions of dollars a day. It's ridiculous. People have to get rid of the blockades and move on. They're making breaking the law okay.
Michael?
Yeah, no, that's not true. Actually, the rule for example, when the Ontario Court of Appeal reviewed this issue when I was in Queen's Park, and there was this issue of a Superior Court judge ordering that, you know, the rule of law was being broken because injunctions were not being respected by First Nations. The Ontario Court of Appeal said, wait a minute here, the rule of law has to encompass, you know, not just what's happening with respect to, for example, the pipeline deals and, yes, the agreement of some First Nations to participate and benefit from those pipeline deals, as they should be able to do so. The rule of law is about a lot more than that. And if we're going to look at the rule of law, then we need to look at the fact that the Wet'suwet'en land was stolen by the Crown. And so in that sense, you know, the rule of law and the injustice is going to be in the eye of the beholder. And I think that that particular person would feel differently if it was something that impacted his family and generations of his family and involved his property being taken by governments.
Hey, John, what do you think? What do you think the response, what do you think of what our guest had to say, who was asking the question, and urging the government to implement what he called the rule of law, to enforce those injunctions?
Well, I'm certainly a very strong believer in the rule of law. But in this case, if we go back a few years to a Supreme Court decision, the rule of law also says that the Wet'suwet'en have never given up their land. They've never ceded the land to the government of Canada or to the Crown, and so that land is still their land. And no matter how you look at it, they can do what they want with their land. So the rule of law does it goes back a lot of years. And there's the aspect of the Wet'suwet'en have always lived there. They've always looked after the land. And that's really what the hereditary chiefs are saying, that we need to look after the land. I don't think they've said no pipeline. I think they've said let's look after the land. And so I think that there's some subtle differences that need to be explored and discussed at great length here.
All right. Some people say, and you know, I've spoken to one chief who was part of the negotiation, elected chief. First of all, John, do you think there's a division coming up between elected chiefs and non-elected chiefs?
Well, there's always been tensions, but I think that certainly as we move forward to having more governance aspect within the nation, I think that there can be a working out of the hereditary chiefs versus the elected chiefs.
Where is
and
that
the
tension?
tensions really are set up by the government in power.
What do you mean? What are the root of those tensions?
Well, the tensions are that the elected chief process was set up under the Indian Act, and that was in the 1800s. And the Indian Act was set up to get rid of Indians and to oppress us, and that really is the whole reason for it being. And the hereditary chiefs were kept under wraps for decades and decades and decades. And then now it's just that they're starting to express themselves and express their responsibilities as hereditary chiefs. And I think that there's room for both in both groups in looking after a nation, their own nation.
Today, Jody Wilson-Raybould, former Attorney General of Canada, now an independent backbencher and also part of the hereditary system, said that she thinks that the Prime Minister should get on a plane and go to Wet'suwet'en and meet with the chiefs. Michael, what do you think?
I think so. I think that makes sense, because a lot of this is about respect. A lot of it is about respect and recognition of the First Nations. However, that's an important move the Prime Minister needs to make, and the timing needs to be right. To go there prematurely might be the wrong move. And so he needs to go, I think. There's no question. I'm just not sure when is the right time. I think he may need to go to break an impasse. He may need to go to try and create peace if it gets worse. I don't know exactly the right time, but once he's gone, there's no sequel to that. There's no next move. We can't bring the Queen in next after that. That'll be the government's big shot at trying to resolve this. You do have, in Carolyn Bennett at least, cabinet minister who has earned the respect, and John, I don't know if you'd agree with this, has earned the respect of a lot of First Nations leaders, and so you know, she's well placed, I would have thought, to do some of that work.
Yes, I agree with you, Michael. Carolyn has earned the respect of many communities and many chiefs, many leaders, and she is in the right place. And I think you're also right that the Prime Minister should go to Wet'suwet'en, should listen, and I think that's a key: listen rather than speak. You know, give government policy and so on, but to listen to the people and understand what they're saying, because that's a real key, is to understand what the people want, what the people are saying.
Okay, we have just a few seconds left, but I want to get your take on the Mohawk blockades here and the role that they play, because a lot of people have asked us at Ask CBC News, why are they so involved in this? And then we hear from the Conservatives today accusing them essentially of being instigators, and it's really not their argument what's happening at Tyendinaga. Michael, what's your take on that? Well,
it's not for the official opposition to say what the motivations are of a First Nation, and you know, this is a First Nation that is firstly expressing solidarity for the cause, and secondly, something that both John and I agree on, you know, giving a big thumbs down to the Government of Canada in terms of the failure to progress on reconciliation, and also that they have the same constitutional right to protest as any Canadian would.
John, what do you think?
Well, the Mohawks, the Haudenosaunee, are often the first to support other First Nations when times are tough, and part of that is that they are part of a warrior society. And when I say warrior, that doesn't mean a soldier. That doesn't mean someone that's prone to violence. What it means is that someone that's going to give of their heart, and the Haudenosaunee are giving of their heart to support their brothers who are on the far side of the country. So they are they're often the very first to do so, and they give up a lot in order to show their support and to show that their solidarity right across the country.
All right, we'll leave it on that note. John Bocage, land disputes mediator and former Grand Council chief, and Michael Bryant, former Ontario Minister of Aboriginal Affairs and former Attorney General. Thank you both for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to hear you again.